This open meeting of the Acton Finance Committee is being conducted remotely, consistent with Governor Baker's executive order of March 12, 2020, due to the current state of emergency in the Commonwealth and the local state of emergency declared by the Acton Board of Selectmen and Board of Health due to the outbreak of the COVID-19 virus. In order to mitigate the transmission of the COVID-19 virus, the Board of Selectmen has suspended all public gatherings. And in accordance with the Governor's order, all members of public bodies are allowed and encouraged to participate remotely. The Governor's order allows public bodies to meet entirely remotely so long as reasonable public access is afforded so that the public can follow along with the deliberations and or board committee votes of the meeting. Ensuring public access does not ensure public participation unless such participation is required by law. This meeting will feature public comment. For this meeting, the Finance Committee is convened by Zoom as posted in the meeting agenda, town's website, calendar, identifying how the public may join. I think that covers it. We've done a lot of these. Y'all know the rules of, talking. I am going to open it up first to public comment. I see that we have some attendees. I don't see any hands up. If anybody would like to raise their hand now. Seeing none, and the first person on our agenda being John Peterson, I'm going to go ahead and promote him. Because I have the power. Welcome, John.
Well, thank you for the promotion, and it's great to be able to speak to you this evening. I appreciate everybody's willingness to spend a few minutes and talk about a hard topic that's near and dear to my heart, which is tax rates. Although, as I was going through, the memo that I sent to you and the slides that I'm going to show you, I realized that there were really two things that I think are very important. One is, just taking a look at tax rates and seeing, how the world looks through that lens. But the other one that I thought was helpful, is seeing this sort of 6-year look at the budget. So a lot of times in the heat of budget season, we get very caught up in, how are we closing the current fiscal year and what's happening next year. But without, understanding what the history of changes is, it's a little difficult to have the right posture for the current fiscal year. And I think that really brings me right to the beginning. So do I have a way to show my slides, or are you going to be showing my slides, Christine?
Really good question. Do I? Who can share? All panelists.
And I can. Oh, look at this. I can share.
You should be able to share.
Okay. I believe I am sharing.
I see your screen.
Yep. That is excellent. So tax rates, another way to look at budgets. So I thought it was appropriate to start, with a little bit of legalese here. I think this group is pretty sophisticated, so you all understand what equalized valuation is, the full and fair valuation of property certified by the DOR. And for people who are wondering, when the 2020 EQV was issued for Acton, it was $4.9 billion. Prop 2.5 is something that, we haven't actually had to focus on, so acutely over the past few years. But again, with the history of budgets, we are now there. So it's important to look at that. The levy limit, of course, is the amount that we can levy without passing an override. And of course, an override, which we have not seen for many years now, is a community vote to increase the tax levy beyond the 2.5% annual allowed increase. Acton is a uniform tax rate community, so we tax all properties the same, and I included that because the question of uniform tax rates might be something people are interested in. Cumulative annual growth rate, but year to year the budget bounces around a little bit, but we can do some math and we can look and see how much it's growing on an annual basis. And then the last thing, where I started out, this issue of a longitudinal study looking at what has happened over a number of years. I think the reason why I felt so strongly about talking about the levy limit and tax rates at this moment in time is you can see how the history of increasing assessments has driven us into the levy limit. So it's not escapable, and it's not just not escapable for FY22, but it's something that we're going to look at in FY23 and FY24. And so I thought that was a helpful perspective in thinking about what we might want to do in FY22. I have a number of disclaimers. I am not an accountant. I have no expertise in municipal finance. So although I've done some simple calculations, I'm not going to be bothered by new growth or overlay or other niceties of municipal accounting. The other thing that's important to me is, I'm interested in 3 or maybe 4 significant figures. I've seen many presentations where we're looking at single dollars, and I can never understand why we would do that. And I would encourage everybody in looking at this to say that, we're interested in the high level perspective on things. And lastly, and most importantly, I am here tonight speaking as an individual, not as a member of the school committee. So with that out of the way, one of the things that I realized that I hated in presentations is people who say, don't tell you where they're going to go. So I said, well, I'm not going to do that to you. I'm going to tell you exactly where we're going to go. So first of all, I think my perspective is we will not have an override in FY22 or FY23. And then once, you make that decision, then you realize that we can't exceed about 2.5% growth in the assessments. Again, I know Mr. Barrett would have noticed there's some wiggle room around there, but we're not worried about that for the purpose of tonight's discussion. And what that then, drives us to is that the school and town assessment should flow from the levy limit. In my view, and I think this is, one of the key sort of takeaways for how to finish off FY22 and march towards 23 is we know how much money we have right at the beginning. We don't need to build budgets up that, exceed that amount of money because there isn't going to be any more money. And of course, everybody who's listening to this realizes that there's a federal wild card and some other, revenue things that could change that. But if we restrict ourselves to the things that we actually have under our control, we know exactly how much money we can raise through property taxes. So the next slide this is just right out of the memo, and I just wanted to make sure that people had a chance to appreciate 2 things. One is, if you start, and of course this is a snapshot starting with full regionalization. So there were about 1 million beautiful things about full regionalization. One of them, of course, is that we separated school finance from municipal finance. So now we can just talk about a relatively clean school budget and a relatively clean town budget. So if we look at that regional budget, it has been growing at about 3.5% per year. And as you can see in red, that is a number greater than 2.5. And so what that means, no matter where you start, eventually, you will see 2.5, and then you will be stuck at the limit. The other thing that I think is important on this slide is that, if we look at the total revenue, which is the assessment plus, Chapter 70 and all the other pots of money that are available to the school, the assessments are really a pretty stable 80% of the budget. It moves around a little bit, but if you want to talk about most of what the revenue picture is for the budget, it's always about the assessment. It's not about some, a small change associated with Chapter 70. And then if you drop down to the second part of this table, the town assessments adjusted per the regional agreement, what you can see is that when we started off, according to Appendix A of the regional agreement, Acton paid about 82.5% of the assessment, and Boxborough paid about 17.5% of the assessment. As we have worked our way through the years and to the end of Appendix A, as we sit here today, for FY21, it was the case that the Acton assessment was 84.4% and the Boxborough assessment was 15.6%. And so if you couple the growth in the budget with that shift, what you get at the end of that is that the Acton assessment, it was growing not at 3.5%, it was growing at almost 4%. And I think this is, one of the key things people have to realize. It's like, well, there is no world where the assessment to Acton can grow at 4%, and we don't have an override. So if we're in the world where we're not going to have an override, then that's the wrong answer. And then on the Boxborough side, their assessment has grown at about 1.5%. So from that trend, they have the ability to live inside the levy limit in perpetuity. That's a growth rate which is perfectly sustainable. Although Mr. Barrett is welcome to correct me, in my universe, the calculation of a tax rate is relatively simple. We know what the assessment is, that portion of the budget that we're going to fund through the property tax. we can go to the DOR and see how much property there is. And then we divide the assessment by the property tax, multiply by 1,000, and we have a tax rate per 1,000. And it isn't more complicated than that. And so I, hope everybody can appreciate that there's some sort of very simple math which connects, all of our budget discussions and everything else to the tax rate. And we'll leave time for rebuttal from Mr. Barrett later. So now with that little bit of information, we can look and we can see what's happened to the value of real property in Acton and Boxborough over the period of regionalization. And you can see that it starts out at about $4 billion for Acton and $1 billion for Boxborough. And in 2020, which is the last reval, this was $4.94 billion for Acton, 1.25 for Boxborough. And since 2022 isn't there, I just extended that for the purpose of my calculations. For the intermediate years, I just took the average of 2018 and 2020 and said, this is the valuation to create the tax rate. Of course, Mr. Barrett knows that that's not the way it really works. We all know that's not the way it really works, but if you want to understand what's going on numerically, that's a good way to do it. The other thing to appreciate from this is that this ratio of property in Acton to Boxborough has been an extremely stable number. Although, I'm only showing you a period of 8 years here. As it turns out, I might have looked at a period of more than 30 years. And this ratio is preserved over that 30-year period. The ratio of property value doesn't change. Student enrollments have changed. And as the enrollments shift back and forth, of course, that shifts budgetary pressures from one town to the other town. But property values, not so much. So now we've got an assessment for Acton and an assessment for Boxborough. We divide them by the property and we get a tax rate. And so for Acton, when we started out first year of regionalization, the tax rate was $12.26 per thousand, and the Boxborough tax rate was $10.14 per thousand. And the Boxborough tax rate as a percent of the Acton tax rate was about 83%. As we go forward, you can see that Acton went from $12.26 up to $12.80. So you can realize that's not growing at a rate of 4%, because of course property values are increasing while the assessment is increasing. So the tax rate is growing, but it's sort of stable. On the other hand, if you look at Boxborough, it's exactly the reverse. So the property values are growing faster than the assessment, and so you start out at $10 in 2015, and as of 2021, the school-related tax rate in Boxborough was $9.38. So as we sit here today, the Boxborough tax rate associated with the schools is 73% of the Acton tax rate. Once I had those numbers, because I had to do some more math, I said, well, I've got the total, I've got the school, so all I have to do to get the towns is subtract, and then we can look and see what happened with municipal services. And I actually was a little bit surprised by this. You can see that in 2015, Acton starts out with $6.79 for municipal services, and that grows, over time up to $7.43. But the cumulative annual growth rate there is relatively low, 1.5%. And in Boxborough, again, the situation is reversed. It starts out at $6.50, but then grows to $7.79. So this is 3%. So in the municipal services category, the Acton growth rate, has been a little less than 2.5. The Boxborough growth rate has been a little bit more than 2.5. And you can see that, again, if you just look at the municipal tax rates and say, how are the towns funding municipal services? In 2015, Boxborough was putting less of their total resource into municipal services, and in 2021, they were putting more. To look at the levy and the ceiling and levy limit in terms of tax rates, all we need to do is we need to take the levy limit and divide it by the EQV. And if we do that for Acton, as you know, and as highlighted in the memo, we have a tax rate of $20.23, and the levy limit, it might not actually be a full penny higher. We're there. We've got 49,000. That's 0.05% of our levy limit that's available to be increased. And of course, the ceiling, nobody's been near the ceiling recently, and the way that the ceiling could show up is if property values were to substantially decrease. There isn't that much room to prevent people from starting to have questions about ceiling. And I did look a little bit at the Commonwealth, and there are some towns that have ceiling issues in terms of their ability to raise taxes, because we at least can have an override above the levy limit. At the ceiling, you got nowhere to go. And you can see here, I've expressed Foxborough's cushion against the levy limit in the tax rate. So their actual tax rate now is $17.17, but the levy limit, it doesn't kick in until they hit $19.62. So they've got about $2.50 that they could use to increase taxes. And I also made a nice little bar chart so people can see, we're all bunched up there between our levy and the levy limit. Foxborough has that gap. And that really brings me to the things that I wanted to suggest for kicking off the discussion, but I'm happy to let this go wherever people want the numbers to take them. As I started off at the beginning, you could build a budget from the bottom up or the top down. I think if we already know the top, and I think because of this structure of our assessment capacity, we absolutely know the top, and so I think that we should be building our budget from the top down, not having this happen this year. Somebody shows a budget that has an Acton assessment going up by 4%. It's like, why did you bother to do that? I think that I always liked telling people you could buy Acton for $4.9 billion, but I think this has sort of almost no impact. I don't think people can really get their head around the $4.9 billion and a lot of these other numbers. So that's why I like tax rates, because we can look at some and say our tax rate's about $20. We're spending 12.5 on the school and 7.5 on the towns. And then people sort of instantly, it's like, oh yeah, I sort of see what's going on here. So I like that. And then the last thing, right where I started, I think taking a longitudinal view of financials, is very helpful. And it's funny because Steve Noon, who sits on the Health Insurance Trust, after we had our last meeting in rate setting, said, you didn't really do a good job of showing the history of rate increases, which is actually germane to this year's rate setting process. So he will be glad to know that I went back to my little cheat sheet and I said, the first step is to look at the history of rate increases, and then you go through the rest of the steps. So that's all I had to say. I hope everybody enjoyed the memo, and I'm very curious what people want to talk about.
Thank you, John. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
Can I just make a comment? I was just going to type it in the chat. Sure. I haven't seen the memo, John. Can you send that to me? And also, I'll be leaving the meeting soon, so if you can send me the presentation, the slides too that you have up here.
I can easily do that.
You should check, Sahana. It was in my spam filter. It was in my, so you might want to check that.
Okay.
Yeah, it was in mine too.
Oh.
No, John, I don't have
Probably that's where it is.
Roland, go ahead.
Yeah, you're right. It's there.
I looked at, from Christine, what you sent out this afternoon, the preliminary budget of the schools, and again, they're looking for over 4% this year. And I mean, I don't know about anybody else in the committee, but I didn't get a 4% raise from my employer. And I think the towns and schools really have to look at it and live within that 2.5%. Say, okay, our budget last year was X. We cannot go above a 2.5% increase. And Steve Noon suggested, and another committee said, no, we don't want to do that, is look at a group of people from finance, from the schools, from the town to get together to see where there is fat that can be trimmed. I'm not saying lose headcount or whatever, but where are there services or where are there things that can be trimmed without impacting the quality of life that the residents of this town enjoy? I think that really has to be looked at. And every company goes through it. My company goes through it every year, and they look at what are we facing against? We're facing the financial services. We're facing against fintech startups like Robinhood that are taking away young investors because they think it's a game. And things along those lines where your competition is constantly breathing down your throat, and you have to look at ways where you can stay nimble and focused, and where's the best use of the resources that we have as a corporation to drive our business forward and also be able to compensate our employees, et cetera. And again, there goes in a lot of unknowns with any business. And the town is no different. The town is a business. when you look at it that way. It's a business for its citizens to plow the road, repave the streets when they need it, take care of trees that fall down, and infrastructure, Kelly's Corner, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I really think that we need to buckle our belts and look at where we can trim and where we can save instead of saying, well, this is a nice have and we should do it just because we have the money. And we have stabilization funds that have never been used. They were established, I don't know how many years ago now, for a rainy day. Well, we're definitely in one. This COVID's taken a big effect on a lot of people, the schools especially. And I think it's time that the schools and everybody look together and saying, okay, do we really need this? Or is this a want versus a must have? And live within that 2.5% and stop raising these rates at 4%. And it's not sustainable. Especially when you keep raising salaries, just because the federal contract will give them a 4% raise each year for the next 3 years. Not sustainable. And I really think we need to, as a town and as a school district, look at that and see where we can really save.
Thank you, Roland. Mike, you had your hand up for a second there. Do you still want to talk?
Yeah, just looking at the whole, or when is the last time we looked at the whole split between Acton and Boxborough? That formula, I know, was the original regionalization was a 5-year deal. I don't think it's been looked at since, and I think it probably for some room for adjustment there. And I think based on how many, the life of the deal so far, maybe we should establish some kind of floor for Boxborough. Like if their rate is below 2.5%, maybe, we need, raise it up a bit to at least give it a ceiling or a floor, of 2.5%, so that Acton isn't always getting screwed.
Jason, go ahead.
I'd like to say that I think you have found kindred spirits with this committee with regard to saying there's no appetite for an operating override. I think I believe when we voted on this as a committee a couple of meetings ago, it was a unanimous vote, if I recall correctly. So there is definitely you definitely found kindred spirits with saying let's not even approach an operating override. But I have a more nuts and bolts question to ask. Given your proposal to just do a 2.5% increase to stay in line with making sure that we never run up against the Prop 2.5 override, is that even possible with the current collective bargaining agreement? Put another way, given that there's a fixed amount of salary increase that is unchangeable for at least the next year, or is it 2 years? Are we in year one of the teacher's contract, or are we in year two? How much of that 2.5 increase is already spoken for the next year or two?
Right. Yeah. So I think, Jason, to your point, if there are any elements of the budget, whatever they are, salaries, healthcare, utilities, that are growing faster than 2.5%, they will present a challenge for the rest of the budget. And I think the rate of salary growth with the current staff is in fact challenging for the budget, which means either that at some point in the future, salaries will need to grow at a slower rate, or there will be less people.
Okay, Adam.
Yeah, I wanted to ask John if he was able to identify sort of the reasoning behind the driver behind that swing, whereby Acton's portion is rising and Boxborough's portion is decreasing. Is that a function of enrollment, or is that a function of direct real estate values? What's the driver behind that shift?
So to knock off the easy one first, the relative valuations of Acton and Boxborough have been extremely stable. So everything you're seeing in terms of money moving around relates to enrollment. And what happened, in the regionalization agreement, and this is probably a little bit off topic, but I'm happy to take it offline if you want to hear more. When we regionalized, the high school was already on an enrollment-based formula. And so Boxborough wanted to preserve that enrollment-based formula. And so what was negotiated was an appendix so that Acton got more money in the first 5 years to compensate for the fact that we were now going to let them also bring in K-6 as an enrollment-based thing. And then the numbers just go wherever they go. So I think, there's some challenges associated with enrollment-based formulas. So since I was around in a time when Boxborough actually had 22% of the population, if you think about what that would mean for Boxborough, if they went from their current 15% to 22%, that means their assessment would increase by 50%, right? Whereas Acton, if Acton goes from 80 to 85, it's a 6% change. It's not great, but it's not horrific. So there's a huge lever. So I think there are dynamics that are embedded in the formula that at a certain point in time, when Boxborough enrollment goes up, Boxborough will say, hey, we really like to talk about the formula again. And so I think, but right now, it's a negotiated agreement. So if you say, is there anybody in Boxborough who wants to negotiate with you right now? The answer is no. Mike?
Yeah, what about if there's someone from out of district that comes into to AB, like they're from, say, Watertown or Waltham or Boston, who gets the hit on that as a percentage? Is it Acton or Boxborough? Or neither? Who pays?
If
You understand the question?
no, I don't.
So Mike, are you suggesting, for instance, a teacher can get their student into the school district? So if a teacher lives in Waltham, works at Miriam, their child goes to Miriam? Is that what you're?
Well, or if it's, I don't know if it's Metco or what, one of those programs that they bring students from say Boston, and they come into the AB regional school system. How does that head count get counted?
So there's no special treatment for any, expense or revenue that would be associated with the school district. So it's just going to go through, the calculator and get divvied up by the enrollment, regardless of what.
So you're saying they're not counted?
Correct.
It's probably a very small number, a percentage of our students. John, do I understand, though, that Boxborough's enrollment has been increasing? Or at least I feel from the last year or two of school committee meetings, I keep hearing that their enrollment is increasing.
Yeah, it did come up off the bottom. So I think they've gone through their nadir. So their high water mark is about 22%, historically, if you go back 30 years. And this, whatever they were at as the average, which was right around 15, that's the low water mark.
Okay. Roland, go ahead, and then Steve, and then I know there's somebody in the audience waiting to speak, and we'll get to them.
John, I want to thank you for doing that and putting it together. It's I think it's very beneficial and kind of lays it out in black and white, so to speak. I think to get what Mike was saying is that, Christine kind of elaborated on, was that, and I know my son has a kid in his class where his parents live in Maynard, and their son goes to AB. So that I would assume that child's going to be paid for, somewhere it's in the budget somewhere that expense is going from somewhere. Is that split evenly between the two towns, or is that, say it's 10 kids, does that get split evenly, or is it all thrown on Acton side and you get the extra 10 kids and you get to pay for the extra 10 kids, that kind of thing?
If a district, sends somebody to us, I believe, well, I think you know what I'm going to do. I'm going to take that offline and I'm going to send a written response so that I don't say something actually in there. How does that sound?
That sounds good. I mean, I'm just curious at how that, because if one town's paying for it, it's not right. And if it's just split, they say, okay, there's 10 kids, 5 is assigned Acton, 5 is assigned Boxborough for the formula split. Then there's nothing to worry about.
Yeah,
I'm assigned Acton, then that's wrong.
I'm pretty sure the way it works is the following, but like you said, I will follow up, in writing. So let's say, a teacher lives in Westford, and so they want their student to come to AB. So we accept their student as a choice student. Every year, the school committee votes a tuition rate for choice students. And so I believe that what happens is Westford then pays whatever that choice student rate is. So that becomes revenue to the district. And then that revenue is just part of general revenues. It doesn't have any Acton or Boxborough tag on it. It's just, AB revenue divided up
Okay,
against everything else.
that makes sense. Thank you.
So, John, I'm good with the idea that we should not have cost increases that are larger than our revenue increases. I think we've been saying that as this committee for quite a few years. I'm still a little mystified by the tax rate. And what's tax rate got to do with it? And how is this? What do you envision as being different from the way we present our budgets? I understand if you want to use some sort of a tax rate guidance as a top-down budgeting. I share Jason and Roland's concern about is that feasible, but to me the tax rate discussion was a bit like a little misdirection. I couldn't quite figure out which who had the ball.
Well, okay, so so I think it is a little bit confusing in that all roads lead to Rome. It's just a little bit of math to get you from one place to another place. One of the things that I had suggested to Dave Bertolino is that at the bottom of Table 6, underneath the assessments, he could include the tax rate. And the alternative to this, of course, is the tax bill for the average single-family house, which is the other thing everybody loves. I sort of like, okay, maybe one of you is living in the average house, but everybody else is living in something different. And that's why I prefer the tax rate to the average single-family house. Plus, I think the EQB thing is all sort of, hard to wrap your head around. But if, one of the questions that came up, and really the reason that I got started on this road, 10 years ago was, you look at comparable school districts and you say, well, Concord's spending $3,000 more per kid than you are. And so is Sudbury, and so are all of these other districts. But we think that we're, interested in education like those other districts. Why are we not spending at that level? And the answer is exactly this. We've got a certain property value that we can tax, and we can only push on it so hard. And so the tax rate reminds everybody that when we're north of $20, we last year I think we're 21st in the Commonwealth out of 351 cities and towns, and it says, yeah, you might love to do X, Y, or Z for a municipal program or for a school program. The money isn't there. And I think that's part of the reason that I wanted to have this discussion. Because people look at it and say, well, aren't you on a school committee? Shouldn't you be advocating for spending a lot more money on kids? I would love to spend more money on kids, but it just wouldn't be responsible because it doesn't respect the tax base and the property owners. It's like, no, people have pushed hard. We have a great school system because they care and because they've contributed. But as far as I can tell, they're pushed about to what is reasonable to ask. And of course, if we asked 10 people, I'm sure we could find, 3 that would say, oh, I would be happy to pay more. We'd find 3 that said, are you kidding me? This is already impossible. And then we'd have a bunch of people in the middle. But that's sort of my take on where we are. And part of talking tax rates is to help maybe move a few more people in that direction.
Well, the tax rate has been relatively stable over the last 7 years, which was pretty much the extent of your research. The prior 7 years, in 2007, 2014, it was not stable at all. In fact, it increased 33%. Now, did our budgets go up 33%? Not really, but our valuation, the assessment, because of the recession in 2008, 2009, did not keep pace. So, yeah, when your valuation is going up 3% a year or something like that, it masks in the tax rate spending issues. So I considered, the tax rate kind of, like I said, a bit of misdirection because at least some of the calculation comes from a variable that no committee in town has any control of, and that's the property values in the town. So that's my concern with just the use of tax rate. Beyond that, if we can't have compensation growing at 4% a year, it being 75% of both towns and schools' budget, and expect we're going to stay within 2.5%. That math doesn't work. So it comes back to how serious can we be about changing our past practices in terms of compensation growth. Thanks.
I think, John, if you put the tax rate on the bottom of table 6, you'd also need to put the average valuation in each of the towns. So each of the single family home valuations, because the tax rate doesn't mean anything if the valuations are, Acton's, Boxborough's valuation is $50,000 more per house than Acton's. I mean, it's got to be, you got to see the both valuations, because they could move to Concord and have a lower tax rate, but my house is assessed higher, so I'm going to be paying more.
Yeah.
So that's kind of going to be on that to say, okay, this is what you're really looking at, versus just having just the tax rate.
Anybody else from the committee? Seeing no hands, I'm going to go ahead and allow Charlie to talk.
Hear me? Can you hear me?
A little louder, Charlie.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Perfect, go ahead.
Okay. First, on the tax rate, I think I was curious to what John had in mind when he, on the memo on the meeting where I mentioned tax rate. I think there are two different things going on here, several more than two. I think it's a great idea for those creating the budgets to keep in mind how potentially close we are to the levy ceiling, which has its own problems. Separately, in a totally different way, taxpayers don't really care about the tax rate, they care about their tax bill. And the two can be presented in two separate ways. I think what John is pointing out is the great difference that the regional agreement has made between what happens in Acton and in Boxborough. And to Mike's point, good luck trying to get Boxborough to come back to the negotiating table. They don't have to. It would be nice if they did, but the problem was created when the regional agreement was voted. Some of us voted against it, too late. We're stuck with it unless we somehow convince Boxborough that this is unfair. And John's calculation of the increase in tax bills, tax rates in Boxborough versus Acton point this out beautifully. But I don't think we can count on that changing anytime soon. To your discussion about how the so-called choice students are assigned, whether Acton or Boxborough, John can look into it. But Christine is right. First of all, it's a very small number of kids. Doesn't really affect the big picture at all. But I believe that they're just not counted. They're in the calculation of the percentage of Acton enrollment versus Boxborough is just not counted. The choice students are not included. It doesn't really much matter. Now, I think it's interesting to look at the increase in the school assessments, because that's where the big money is. And if you can somehow convince the school committee to limit their school budget and therefore the assessments, because the Acton and Boxborough assessments are simply derived from the overall budget plus whatever money they get from the state and so on. That would be very good, but I don't see that's been happening. The schools and I'll say it very bluntly, have not been particularly concerned about limiting expenses. Something close to between $500,000 and $750,000 was wasted on the Glen Brand fiasco. We're now looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars and changing the mascot, a totally ridiculous proposition that's being actively discussed in town, but the school committee has already decided not to revisit it. So how is that going to help? I think there are many aspects of the school budget which are far from frugal, and the simple fact of why Acton spends less than Concord or other towns on per student, because we have, on a percentage basis, more students for our population. Historically, there's plenty of evidence that how much we spend on a student has very little to do with the achievement. Some of the most successful years in Acton, when we were grossly underspending the state average per student in the 70s and early 80s. You know, we were top 3 high schools in the state, flag of excellence and all that. Money had very little to do with it. So, you know, this is a simplistic class size, money, evaluation of a school system, MCAS and all that. Of course, this year, everything's going to change anyway. But I wouldn't, I think the finance committee, and this is irrelevant, is going to have to take a very hard look at its position on the budgets that are going to be presented soon, and especially the school budget, you know, not accept all of the assumptions that go in. And it would not be the first time, but it's rare, if the finance committee were to recommend not accepting the school budget at town meeting. It can be done. It creates problems, but
Charlie, I really appreciate your input. I'm going to go ahead and stop you there.
okay. There's a lot to this, and I appreciate you letting me talk, but I did spend a few years on the FinCom, so I'm not totally unfamiliar with these subjects that have come up before. But John has a good idea. I think it has to be implemented in the correct way.
Thank you. John, thank you very much for your presentation and for the discussion.
Well, thank you. It was great to join you. I look forward to the day when we can all meet in town hall.
Excellent. That would be great. I'm going to move you to attendee.
Thanks, John.
All right. Next on our agenda is FY21 Q2 update. Take it away, Steve.
Good evening, Madam Vice Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
If possible, let's see here. Would it be okay to share my screen?
Please do.
See what I can do here. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me in front of you tonight. Just a quick comment on Citizen Peterson's presentation. I think those disclaimers might have been a little bit off because, as you can see, Citizen Peterson is a good accountant and he's pretty good at municipal finance. So anyways, that was a good presentation. So right at it, I'm here to present the first quarter or the second quarter financial results. Little note on the corner there, February 9th. Last year we appeared in early March. A real shout out to the accounting and tax collector staff for help getting this presentation ready. Teresa O'Leary, Joanne Norton, Brian McMullen, Jashira Gonzalez, and Tara Bicknell. So thanks to them very much. When we're done with this, we'll be able to file this on the web under the town's budget heading on the homepage.
Excellent. Could you share it? We're not seeing it.
Oh, so
I'm sure it's amazing.
can you see it now?
There we go. Thank you so much.
Sorry about that. Let's see here. Slideshow from the beginning. Is that a little better?
Yes, that's perfect.
Sorry about that. So yeah, our data will be uploaded to the town's website. So let's go at some data here. Everything in life is timing, and we try to size up some of these things to make it a little more understandable. Let's talk about total revenue for the town for FY21. If you look at the ALG plan, you'd see 104.3 million. And we're showing 100 million. What is that? Well, the ALG plan includes 1.1 million in reserves. We also had, and we talked about this a little bit internally, we had about 3.3 million of debt exclusions that were billed out in Q3 and Q4. So to kind of give you a total revenue picture halfway through the year, we made a couple of adjustments. Our year-to-date revenue, if you looked at our Munis reports, is at like 48.8 million. That ends up at a 48.5% actual. And if the committee says, gee, why aren't we at 50%? You're short. I'd say, yeah, that's true. But one little timing difference, we have $3 million of motor vehicle excise, roughly, that's billed in the second half of the year. So, if you factor that in, we'd be in a good spot, closer to the 50%. And in total, last year's number was 49%. So at this point, last year we're at 49%. Now we're at 48.5. Okay. The next line, the next row, property tax revenue. As the committee knows, this is the big driver for the community. Approximately 92% of all of the general fund services come from the property tax levy. So if you looked at the tax recap, it would say 95.9 million. We use 92.6 million as our go-to number halfway, for the year, because we pulled out 3.3 million in those debt exclusions. Let me give you a minute on that. When we went to town meeting June 29th, 2020 to approve budgets, we actually approved the town budget and the school budget. Those budgets being approved so late, we were not able to put the full impact of the town's spending decisions on the tax bill in the first 2 quarters. Those 2 quarters are billed out roughly 2 weeks before the year starts. So that didn't help us, but if you look at the total revenue for property taxes, we're at 45.8 million, and that translates to 49.4%. If you annualize that, again, you still come to the 98, 99%. We see no deterioration of the town's property tax collection rate. And to that, I thank the folks on the committee as well as the listening audience. State aid, we're doing just fine with. MSBA, that is the $923,000 a year we get from the state for the reimbursement from the first twin school that was built probably 15, 20 years ago. This last row is where we'll talk a little bit more on the next slide, our local receipts. Our local receipts, our estimate for the fiscal year is about 5.6 million. We've only taken in 1.3 million year to date halfway through the year. And we'll get into it in a second, but the big thing has to do with the majority of our motor vehicle is billed after the first of the year. And that's because the Registry of Motor Vehicles works on a calendar year basis. So from a high level, this chart looks very similar on some levels to last year, especially the total revenue and the property tax revenue. So that indeed is a good thing. What we tried to do on this next chart, and this hasn't been in our quarterly updates in the past, But in talking to John Mangiarotti, he thought it was important that any area where we felt some potential, vulnerability, that we try to be as transparent as possible and give the finance committee everything we had on it. So if you look at our local receipt category, the total is 5.6 million. We had 1.3 million year to date. That's about 23%. Well, if you dig into that, the biggest one being motor vehicle excise, that revenue item budget is about 3.5 million. We've only taken in about 345,000 for the year, but as you see in the footnote at the bottom, we just received note within a week that commitment number one is 2.6 million. To be totally transparent, last year's commitment one was a little over 2.9 million. So we do see a little bit of a sensitivity there. We've also been told that the registry is a little bit behind in some of their processing. But on some levels, if you look at that 10% on motor vehicle excise at this point this year, last year we're at 11.9. So, I think we believe we have at least 2, maybe 3 more commitments to come in before our fiscal year closes. But if you took the 2.6 million plus the 345,000, right now, in terms of a build number, we're close to 3 million. And, we believe that if there is, a vulnerability, it will be minor. But we'll get into that. Fees and licenses or permits, this number is at 44% for the year. It's down a little bit versus last year at this time. It was about 55% last year at this time. Meals tax is doing fine. The state has made a commitment to fund our meals tax. It's looking like, and that revenue category is right on. The one category that we know we're going to have a problem with will be investment income. The 66,000 you see year to date there, that's for all funds. Just to give you an idea, last year the 62% was 130%. The reason we're having such a hard time with this is when we set the 21 budgets, in December of 2019, we'll say, our core rate of return on risk-free funds was probably in the 1.3, 1.4, 1.5 range. Now that risk-free rate of return, as the committee knows, is 20 or 30 basis points. The big difference here on this revenue category versus the recession of 2009 and 10 is the base amount of that category. Back then, I think our revenue base for investment income was about 700,000. So when rates dropped through the floor, we had a good way to go. The reality of it is we haven't had that high interest rates in a while. So, we do believe we're going to have some problems with investment income. But again, the budget for that is not the highest. So that shouldn't be too bad. In terms of our spending, if you look at the bottom line budget that's granted to Town Manager Mangiarotti from town meeting, we're on a 51% spending level halfway through the year. If you pull out one item, or 2 items, I guess, our pension and our OPEB funding, that was about $5.1 million, and we spend that money in the first quarter of the year. If you just pull out half of that 5.1 million and move it to the other half of the year, the spending comes down to about 44, 45% for the year. So, we'll get into it a little bit on why that is, but, our spending is below kind of a linear average, and that's a good thing. So now on to the enterprise funds. The first one being our Septage enterprise funds. Under the guidance and direction of Health Director Cheryl Ball, who is knee deep in a health crisis, Cheryl's done a good job juggling and working this fund. This fund, as you see, on a liquidity basis, profit and loss is providing liquidity. We see no real issues with this fund. The revenues are in line on a linear basis, and the expenses are actually down versus last year. So we anticipate no issues moving forward with this fund. The Transfer Station and Recycling Fund, under the guidance of DPW Director Corey York, this fund is doing fine. If you look at the fees, we have sticker fees that are primarily sold in the fall, and that's why a lot of the revenue comes in the first half of the year. As some of the committee might remember, we also moved the financial model to also have some pay-as-you-throw in there on the bags. And, that has done a good job in decreasing our municipal solid waste and increasing our recycling. So, we are very comfortable with the results of this fund. Again, we look at liquidity, which is cash flow, and the year-to-date is a positive number. So that fund, again, we don't have any concerns with that fund. The Sewer Enterprise Fund is, another one of our operating funds. If you look at the year-to-date revenue of 42%, and you say, gee, why isn't that 50% if it's operating so well? Well, there's one key item there. We build the schools. So when we built the sewer project back 15, 20 years ago, the schools were given an avoided cost of $5.5 million, and they would have paid over 30 years. The math is $184,000 a year. We build that in the second half of the year. So if you put $185,000 into the number, we're right near the pen in terms of a linear year-to-date allocation. So we don't see any issues there. This fund, Director York, we used to do a lot of this work with Health Director Doug Halley. When Doug retired, John Mandrati transitioned this over to DPW, and working with Director York on this, this fund is doing just fine. So the Ambulance Enterprise Fund, this is an interesting fund. From July through now, or actually since last March, there's been less sports, there's been less leisure activities, there's been less traffic, and so there's been kind of less bad things happening, and that's a really good thing for the citizens. And our revenue, and the Enterprise Fund is managed by Fire Chief Robert Hart. The revenue in this fund is actually held in there, given some of the restrictions on, different activities. So, we're kind of surprised that the year-to-date revenue was kept in there. It's hung in there at 45%. You will see, and that's probably on an accrual basis, but we have a little bit of a loss year-to-date, and that highlights, the need to continue to put a subsidy to that fund. That fund literally saves lives. We're now part of a advanced life support. We were part of a group advanced life support. We now provide advanced life support for our community only. We have, I think, 8, 9, 10 paramedics on staff, and this does save lives as response times have gone down. So we're comfortable with this fund. If it did extrapolate out and lose $300,000 for the year, you see how important it is to be well reserved. So that $610,000 could absorb that. But overall, I think we've been happy that the revenue side of this hasn't been, really impaired, by the pandemic. So here's an interesting one, the Transportation Enterprise Fund. Under the leadership of Governmental Affairs Director Austin Saganowicz, Austin has dug into this fund. When the pandemic hit in March, we were in FY20. As we rolled into FY21, a couple of things happened. John worked with Austin and myself on some different things to try to scale back this program. The town manager negotiated with our transportation vendor a new contract for services. And as you can see, our year-to-date outlay is around $30,000 a month. And, you know, when Austin and I and Brian sit around reviewing numbers and really just pushing through the data, we've scaled this program back to serve our vulnerable citizens. And these are for doctor's appointments and pharmacy appointments and to the grocery store. And it's still a very important program. And, you know, what I think is going to happen is there's going to be a little bit of liquidity left, fund balance left, because of the scaled back version. So even though there's a kind of a negative number in the liquidity line, we're very comfortable that this enterprise fund, when we close the books at 6/30/21, will be able to help provide some flexibility going forward. So, you know, at the end of the day, when we work through data, we talk to citizens, we talk to the committee, the board, we realize that the unemployment rate for our citizens has essentially doubled, you know, through the pandemic. This slide gives you kind of a high level on some of the towns. And, you know, I wouldn't call it relief packages, but I would call it assistance packages, rental assistance, mortgage assistance, all sorts of things. And I'm going to go into a little detail here, but you know, we have spent a lot of time, as we should be, reacting to the, you know, the vulnerable citizens that have lost their jobs. Our social services coordinator, Laura Duchamp, you know, is doing a really great job, and she puts in a lot of time with a lot of these programs. And let me give you a little more detail on what we're doing with these programs. You know, again, 162,000 in small business grants. That was September. We went to town meeting. That came out of the general fund. That was very well supported at town meeting. The town received a CARES Act allotment. John Mangiarotti was quick to act and move on rental assistance and mortgage assistance. So, you know, we're actively trying to assist those citizens that have been impacted. And again, a roof over your head, rental assistance and mortgage assistance is really important right now. And, you know, we're right in the middle of it. We also, you know, Acton Barstow United Way COVID grant. And, you know, I've listed the items up here, but it's been an awesome resource for additional rent, mortgage, utilities, car repairs. You know, an excellent resource. Also, within the last few months, the town was awarded a multi-community grant for $1.6 million from Community Development Block Grant. You know, it's funny, Community Development Block Grants, back in the day, I used to audit a lot of cities, and those were small cities block grant programs. They've shifted the focus on these. And right now, you know, we're happy to report that approximately $1.2 million will be awarded in some micro enterprise grants. These are forgivable loans to small business with greater than a certain number of employees. It's desperately needed in the town and the surrounding communities. There's also money here for child care subsidies as well as food pantry assistance. And, you know, this is going to be, you know, we're working through some details on this. This is going to be a real aid to the region, the regional area. We also have seen some sensitivity and some need on our food security programs and the Acton Food Pantry, the Neighborhood Brigade for Food Delivery, the Acton Barstow Regional School District weekly meal kits. You know, the region is a great partner. You know, you got to remember they are used to serving thousands of students a day, and they were in a very good position to, you know, leverage that program. And they're a great partner, and they're helping out every day with food security for the taxpayers. We also have fuel assistance programs that are listed there. So whether it's a social services coordinator or you contact the town manager's office or town finance, we can get you in the right spot. Lastly, this chart, and I think John Mangiarotti sent out a memo to the Finance Committee a few hours ago with a lot more detail than I have here. But this chart shows the property tax exemptions granted the last 5 years, 6 years, and it's almost doubled. So we're working hard to try to find ways to match the person with the eligibility criteria with the right program. As John's memo displays, there are a lot of different programs out there that are statutorily guided, and they have different income bases and eligibility requirements. So if there's any questions on that, then our taxpayers should contact the assessors department, and we'll be more than happy to come out and to come work through that with you. So I want to show you a couple of slides you might remember from 8 months ago. In early June 2020, John Mangiarotti and myself, but I think John appeared before the Finance Committee, and what he wanted to address was, as we went into FY21, what would happen if certain revenue categories experienced a shortfall? And we did the shortfalls in percentages, 5, 10, 15%, and then converted that to dollars. So again, this was last June, looking out over the horizon and us kind of handicapping what a potential shortfall would be. Well, when you look at this 7, 8 months later, on the state aid side, and again, this is just for the town, not the school, on the state aid side, we've been assured by the state that 100% of our state aid will come in. So that's the word on state aid from the ground right now. But state aid, we don't believe that range is in play as we move towards the end of the year. We do, however, believe that the local receipt range may be in play. So last June, we said, hey, if there's a 5% problem or almost a $300,000 problem in local receipts, all the way up to an $800,000 problem, so we ranged that out. And the other slide we did, and I think John explained it pretty well last June, but this slide says, hey, what will we do if we have, $1.5 million revenue problem? Well, we can go up to $650,000 if we keep the hiring freeze in place. As the committee knows, John put a hiring freeze in place. It's been in place since last March. He's had to obviously fill public safety vacancies, but things like the town engineer, and some other positions, and there's probably a dozen or more of them, John's had to hold the line and not fill them. So this slide kind of ratchets up levels of cuts or savings to handle a revenue shortfall. I think that we've already kept the hiring freeze in place, for over half a year. So again, what's reflected on that slide with year-to-date expenses is the result of some of our actions in these areas. So again, last June, we told the committee what areas we'd be looking at if there was a potential revenue shortfall, and these are the actions that we will be taking if necessary. And I think that is it. So why don't I stop sharing and take any questions? Thank you, Madam Vice Chair.
Thanks. Does anybody have any questions or comments for Steve? Mr. New.
Thank you, Steve. That was a good presentation. How much of a shortfall on local receipts do you think people aren't driving, so yeah, excise tax is going to be down. Nobody parks in the commuter lot anymore because they don't have to go to work. What in that range of percentages, how far off do you think we'll be?
Yeah, that's literally the $1 million question. So, let me work backwards to your comments. You're right. The commuter parking lot fund is really getting mauled. We have 5 cars in there, and there's hundreds of spaces. So the commuter parking lot is not having a good year. So that's the case there. But in terms of local receipts, I think me personally, I breathed a bit of a sigh of relief when that excise commitment came in at 2.6 million. The 2.6 million plus the year-to-date revenues gets us close to 3 million. And as I commented, we should have at least 2, if not 3 more commitments left. So, I think you're right. I think there could be, if there's a 5% problem there, that's $150,000 or $200,000. Our local receipts in the fee and permit areas you saw, we're trending off a linear 50% trend. So we presented 44%. So if you take, 6% half the year times 2 is 12% on a $1.7 million base, that could be another, couple $100,000. So, I got to assume if things trend the way they're going, worst case I would think would be a $300,000 or $400,000 problem. It'd probably be a 5 to 6% local receipt issue. That's kind of what we're seeing now, Steve. Depending on what that second and third excise commitment are, those are pretty key. But our sensitivity, our vulnerability right now is confined to local receipts and primarily investment income, motor vehicle excise, and fees. But again, it's a $5.5 million revenue source. If we have a 5% problem, that's $250,000. So, I think, we're planning on a 5 to 8% problem right now. But, again, as every day moves forward, we get new information. But, again, we did breathe a sigh of relief when that excise commitment came in at 2.6 million.
It's good the state is sticking by the number. I wasn't overly concerned about this year for the state anyway. It's next year and the year after that when they've exhausted their rainy day fund to balance their budget, something's going to have to give unless things have improved.
Yeah, so I forget when it was in the fall, but the state came out with guidance that vendors with meals tax could pay the state in May. And, we looked around at each other and said, May? And then we basically got, we got a quarter's worth of our revenue for meals tax, both quarters. So, yeah, we're very happy with how the meals tax money has come in the face of the pandemic and things like that, and the state aid numbers have come in. So, yeah, I think you're probably right that, they can only hold the line so far, but that's the guidance we have now.
So is the source of most of our state aid lottery sales? Should we all be going out and buying lottery tickets?
No comment. It's unrestricted state aid, and so, yeah, that might be a big piece of it. But, I believe some of their receipts are off too. So, I think, I think it's a wait and see type of thing. But I guess I'd probably agree with you, though, that the state can only keep propping everybody up for so long.
Okay. Thank you.
Roland?
So when you talk about the car excise tax, vehicle excise tax coming in, I know since COVID hit, I have saved over 35,000 miles driving back and forth to Rhode Island to my job. So my next used vehicle is further down the line than what it would normally have been. By probably right now about 2 years. So that obviously has an impact, et cetera. On the meals tax side, it looks like we're running pretty close to what you had projected for the year. Doesn't look to be off that much. And I'm wondering if that's just because local residents have been supporting the restaurants doing more takeout than what you would have normally seen. And I guess there's got to be some kind of impact to that where people are not going out to the restaurants and sitting down and having a few drinks with dinner and all that type of stuff. So I would assume that we would see a difference, maybe not right now, but going into this quarter and the next quarter, we'll see a drop off over the winter. So I'm kind of wondering.
Well, let me take you in the weeds a little bit. In FY20, our meals tax revenue was over $300,000. Normally, the way the state mandates that we set the tax rate, they won't let you budget more than kind of last year's actual receipts. But they actually said to us, you can't budget your 309. And they said, you can budget 280. And when I said to them, why can we only budget 280? And they said, well, in September, you got 70. 70 times 4 is 280. Now, all of our heads went around, and we said, well, that's not usually how we do it. And they said, well, this is how you're going to do it. We're giving you a $280,000 line item, and true to their word, like you say, Roland, we're right at the number. So we can't comment specifically because we don't have the data. So to Steve Noon's comment, how are they paying these meals taxes out when there's been devastation in that industry? So we really don't have that data. We can try to maybe get something for you for the third quarter, but the state gave us that budget item. It was less than last year's total, and they set the rules on how we set the tax rate. So I really can't give you any insight if restaurant participation has been up or not. I try to go to Philo's every now and then, but we'll try to get you some more information on that, Roland.
Thanks. There's still a hiring freeze within Manager Mangiari's budget right now. Is that correct?
There is, except for key critical positions, mainly public safety. You also have to look outside and say that, John probably had to fill some DPW positions to take care of the snow. But,
my streets get narrower and narrower in my neighborhood. And I don't think they're taking away pavement. They just don't do a very good job, especially some of the intersections. They're extremely dangerous. And they don't go to the edges anymore. And when I first moved here 15 years ago, we had great snow removal in town. I mean, they get right down to the edge. They did a really fantastic job. And now they're leaving 3 feet on either side. And it's kind of a safety issue in a lot of ways. But I said, you know what, I'll wait a little bit and see what happens so as I'm not jumping on the town manager. I'm just wondering if anybody in his department that's in charge of that goes around and looks at the different neighborhoods and looks at what the contractors are doing, saying, you're not meeting your standard or our standards, and holding them accountable.
Well, sure. I can tell you that John's very responsive to the taxpayers.
I agree.
And, he's always out and about, looking around. So, I got an email from him on Friday, and he wanted an answer to a question before his 10 o'clock Java with John meeting. So, John is very accessible. He's very citizen friendly. His, customer service has always been something that's been important to us. And now, and with John at the helm, it's even more important, or it's really the key. So, in terms of the snow removal, it's not my sweet spot. These are tough jobs. Moving snow in the middle of the night. And you got to remember, a lot of the crew, are the existing crew. So they're working the second or third shift for themselves doing this. But, rest assured that if you send John an email, he might actually be on his way to your house now, Roland, to take a look. So maybe he's not watching tonight.
Yeah, I'm not talking about the town staff. I'm talking more of the contractors that are hired, because my neighbor was primarily contractors that do it, except for one of the sanding and salting type of thing in the towns. They've been great with that. And that's been right on the money.
Well, you bring up a good point. I'm not sure if you remember, but over the summer, I think we had one of those message boards going. You know, we couldn't find people to work. Snowplow drivers, and whether the private sector. We've had problems getting the private sector, to come in and do some of this, and whether this work isn't as profitable anymore or not. But there's been. It seemed to me over the years there's been fewer, smaller operations that'll come out and do plowing for the town. So I think the contractor pool has been a little bit smaller, and that maybe hasn't helped either on that issue.
Thank you.
Anyone else? All right, Steve, I know that I had asked you over email if you could do a little primer on the difference between residential and business tax, but I think I'm going to ask you to hold off until our next meeting when we have a few more of our members and our junior members.
That would be fine.
Definitely wait. Okay. Pulling up the agenda now. Finance Committee business. Does anybody have any committee reports? Roland.
I don't have any committee reports, but I do have a public service, maybe that Mike might be interested in, is that if you're a veteran, the VA has COVID shots that they have basically an unlimited supply. And I brought my father-in-law over at Bedford last week. He went through the Veterans Affairs officer, who did a fantastic job, got his paperwork over to the VA. They got it on Wednesday or Tuesday, and the next day they called and said, it's all set. Can you come in this afternoon for a shot? And I brought him over, and took longer than I wanted to be there, waiting in the car, but they brought him in, gave him the shot, said, okay, here's your next shot in 3 weeks. See you in 3 weeks. So for anybody who's a veteran, get stuff into the VA and go over and get your shot.
Go ahead, Mike.
I got my second shot today, so I'll soon be 95% immune. So to hell with all you guys. I'm protected.
Mike's going out for dinner.
That's right.
Well, go spend some money, yeah.
Hey, I bought 2 cars this year, or will be buying 2 cars.
We
So
do
be on
this
the
part.
lookout, Steve.
You buy some nice Teslas or something like that, Mike, so you can get some.
Mini Coopers.
Oh, very nice. All right, Steve Noon.
Yeah, Steve Barrett, you can help me out on this one. The Healthcare Trust met last Thursday, and previously we had given guidance of a 5% increase in rates for budgetary purposes. And this meeting, we were confronted with new data from both Harvard Pilgrim and Blue Cross, who administer the plans, even though we are self-insured, that we should expect a very large COVID bubble, and not the kind of bubble that you have with your family, but a significant increase in costs. And while we, as a group, decided to discount some of what they were saying, we have changed our guidance to 7% as opposed to 5%. And it should, if we were doing our mental math correctly in the meeting, add about $100,000 for every 1%. So it's a $200,000 problem spread across town and schools. Did we get that right, Steve?
Yeah, you did. I mean, on the town side, we spend a little over $3 million on health insurance for the town staff and the retirees. So, another 2% is another 60 or 70,000 onto the town budget for the town side.
So that's the bad news. The only good news I can say is we could have gone higher based on the data we were looking at, but
Yeah, no, I mean, real quick, yeah, it was, I don't know what the right term is, sobering maybe, but seeing the healthcare companies estimating, another 6%, on top of normal inflation or medical inflation, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, that was, that's going to lead to a rough year for the trust if it does in fact materialize. So we'll see how that happens. And yeah, I think when we were looking at the data, Steve, last Thursday, the 7% is probably the floor of what we could have gone with. But to talk to an earlier point, when you have Middlesex retirement going up 7-8%, health insurance going up 7 or 8%, it's tough to hold down these budgets. So we fight the fight, as they say. But yeah, that was a tough pill to swallow last Thursday.
Yeah, well, what we decided as a group was that we would take some risk because we still have substantial reserves. But if the worst case scenario comes through, we will have barely adequate reserves going into the next year. So that's the depressing news. And when Steve said sobering, don't take that literally. We meet at 8:15 in the morning.
Well, after those kind of meetings, stay sobering. These are COVID times. All right. The school committee met and they're meeting again on Thursday. You all have the budget information. There's a lot in there in your email. Feel free to go through it at your leisure, and there will be more updates. It is definitely my impression that the schools are very aware of Acton's levy limit issues and that they are striving to bring the numbers down to something that we can manage and they can still efficiently run the schools. It's brought up several times. It was brought up several times by several members during the entire discussion, including Peter Light. So I feel like they're on track. We'll see where their final numbers come.
Well, I didn't look through this packet. The last packet I looked through, I was concerned because what I was seeing it characterized as a level service budget, but yet our assessment was still going up more than 4%.
Right.
Which makes you wonder, well, just how much can they do with it?
Yes. So right. So they're looking to offset. They're looking to, honestly, unfortunately, combine their ceiling for payments for Middlesex and OPEB, which we have consistently pushed them to spend more on OPEB and then asked them to at least hold their spending on OPEB. And I think they're going to end up between the two reducing some of their spending on OPEB. They're talking about a little more usage of reserves. They are talking about cutting some budgets for the buildings. So they're looking at a few different options.
Absolutely, but this is not a one-year issue. And as Steve just pointed out, and as we mentioned in our discussions with John Peterson, it's a compensation issue, and that's a big piece of their spending every year. And if it's not a 2.5%, then you're fighting a losing battle trying to make the budget come in even close to 2.5% or even 3%.
Agreed.
I hope they don't defer spending on the buildings where they need to spend, just kicking the can down the road, and then 2 through 3 years down the road, we could have spent $100,000 in 2022. It's now going to cost us $125,000, $130,000, $140,000 to do the same thing because of inflation and we let it go too far and it got worse type of thing. I think they got to be very cognizant of the trade-offs at times that they make by deferring things that on a building maintenance type issues where they just compound over time. And, you know, you think you're saving $1 today, it's costing you $3 tomorrow because it wasn't properly planned out.
I agree. I would say with the size of the school system that there's always going to be stuff to fix and maintenance
Absolutely.
to do, and you know. Go ahead, Steve.
No, I think, you know, not to get into prior recommendations, but we did tell them months ago that they ought to be looking at cost savings, a more formal review than just what you can do this year. And long-term planning. We're at a point where we're either going to abide by the levy limit or we're going to abide by the ceiling. And if we're abiding by the ceiling, then we need an operating override. It's been a long time since one was even attempted in this town. And as for, you know, regionalization, then permit me and Mike to say, we didn't vote for that. Way back then we said, and we could prove this was not going to be in the long-term best fiscal interest of the Acton taxpayer. Our taxes would keep going up and up and up.
I had a conversation with somebody who was on said, well, we saved $100,000. I said, well, you got to show that at town meeting how you saved that $100,000 or $1 million. And never seen it. That's one of the reasons we had the full vote. I voted against it. I agree.
Well, I'll bring it up with Christy. I'm happy to go back at the next ALG meeting, and maybe there'll be some openness to some sort of committee over the summer when things are quieter, with representatives from the school and the town and the finance committee to look for some ongoing cost-saving measures. I think it's definitely worth broaching again.
Thank you.
Yep. All right. We don't have any minutes. Adam, do you have anything to report?
No updates.
Okay. Just gonna really quickly. Good. I will entertain a motion.
I move that we adjourn.
Second.
All right. Adam.
Aye.
Steve.
Aye.
Mike.
Aye.
Roland.
Aye.
And I say aye.